All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is a program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Russ Muirhead, James Russell Muirhead, known to his friends and even to his enemies as Russ. He graduated from Harvard in 1988, it says here, and then became a Rhodes Scholar. Went to one of those English universities and got another BA there.
Balliol.
Yeah. That's the
Not
best.
just one of them.
No.
Yeah.
That's, all right. We can't improve on that. And now except that he's now a big shot professor at Dartmouth. Robert Clements Professor of Democracy.
And politics.
And politics. Right. One or the other. And he's here for the semester teaching Gov 1080 on American political thought. His books are Just Work, meaning mere work, or just work done justly.
That's right. Getting what you deserve. Is it getting what you deserve, or is it just work?
Good. All right. That's his first book, and his second book is The Promise of Party in a Polarized Age. And he's going to talk today about democracy and demagoguery. So, Russ.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And it is in fact an honor to be here at the seminar in the program on constitutional government. Partly because I do remember invading this occasion throughout my graduate student years, and not just because you served beer, but partly because of that. And thank you for having me here this term in the program on constitutional government. It's a real pleasure and an honor. National elections, presidential elections, are sort of mirrors on in which the country can see itself, and they set a kind of interpretive task. We try to understand ourselves, or we try to see ourselves. We try to understand what we see in the mirror that's provided by the result of a national election. Last week in this seminar, Paul Peterson said that trying to understand ourselves in the mirror of the 2016 election is a mistake because of just a few thousand votes. If 10 or 50 or 100,000 votes across just a few states had shifted, then Hillary Clinton would be the president today, and no one would be talking the way we're talking now and trying to understand the country. So he says to interpret ourselves in light of the presidential election result is a real distortion. But I think actually, even if Trump had lost to Hillary Clinton, we would still have the same interpretive burden, partly because he captured the Republican nomination, and there's no reason why he should have. No one expected he would have. I remember writing a paper on conspiratorial thinking in the fall of 2015, sort of as the nomination primary contest was ramping up, and I used an example from one of Trump's comments over the summer of 2015, and I thought, as I was writing it, that I shouldn't put it in there because I thought when this article is published, people will read it and think that I was grasping, from the clown-like extremes of American politics and making a lot of something that ultimately just disappeared. Well, now he's president. And even if he weren't president, or just the Republican nominee, that would still be something to explain. Plus the fact that in the Democratic Party, someone who wasn't a Democrat, Bernie Sanders, nearly captured the nomination from Hillary Clinton. So I think that the interpretive agenda that we have in trying to understand what we see when we look in the mirror of the election of 2016 is actually the same, whether we think of Trump winning or losing. And then there's also the fact that he did not lose. That he is the president. That's an incredibly powerful office. It's powerful not just with respect to, maybe it's not powerful at all right now with respect to policy. They don't seem to be able to pass a single piece of legislation through the Republican Congress. But it's very powerful with respect to, I think, the moral formation of the country. The president can set the tone and also set kind of the limits. It can give us a vocabulary that we use to describe ourselves and also also mark some vocabulary as off limits, or disempower other sorts of terms that we might use in trying to describe ourselves. So this is, for the moment, the age of Trump. And when we look in the mirror that the election of 2016 offers, the first word on everyone's lips is demagoguery. It's interesting because I taught a seminar, teaching American political thought in the age of Trump is a very different experience from teaching it just a few years ago. And I taught, I don't remember what, maybe it was a seminar. I think it was a seminar. I might have even been teaching this book, Jeffrey Toulis's The Rhetorical Presidency. And none of the students in my class knew what the word demagoguery meant. So they'd never heard the word before, and they never used it. I had to put it up on the board and explain that it meant a popular leader. Well, what's so big about, what's so concerning about popular leaders? Isn't that what democracy has, are popular leaders? And I tried to explain how demagogues, through their flattery and through their sort of intentional divisiveness, can tear a country apart in the context, can destroy a republic, say, in the process of elevating themselves. And we read All the President's Men. And I tried to say, imagine Huey Long. This was a sort of demagogue, and we try to conjure a demagogue up out of our imagination, and the students played along, as good students will, but I don't think they had any real feel for what demagoguery was. And now it doesn't take any work. Even in an undergraduate class, in the first lecture, you can start talking about demagoguery, and everyone knows what you mean because of Donald Trump. Toulis writes in this book, he says that the founders' preoccupation with demagoguery, he says, may appear today as quaint, yet if it does, that may be because we don't fear demagoguery today, only because the founders were so successful in institutionally proscribing some forms of it. So even he acknowledges that the concern that just the use of the word demagoguery is going to come across as quaint. In the winter and spring of 2017, I don't think it is quaint. And the question is, how potent is the threat? What if it is a threat? What path might it take? And here I think the argument that Toulis makes in the Rhetorical Presidency is possibly it's the best guide I've located to understanding the threat of demagoguery in the age of Trump. Toulis writes about how the 19th century presidency was formal and restrained. You could think of it as the constitutional presidency. Presidents hesitated to present themselves before the public at large, and when they did, they spoke in very, very officious tones, maybe giving constitutional advice or interpreting their role as a president in the constitutional order, but not appealing to popular passions, often not talking about policy and program, and certainly not presenting themselves as the instrument of popular purposes. That changes in the 20th century with the rhetorical presidency that Woodrow Wilson creates on Toulis's account. Wilson thinks that the president needs to be more of a popular leader, indeed, more of a demagogue. And he thinks that the president needs to be this because of a defect in the constitutional order. The Constitution meant to create what Hamilton called an administrative politics, a politics of administration rather than a politics of rule. And what distinguishes a politics of administration are its limited purposes. The politics of administration is limited to maybe enforcing natural rights, to policies that conduce to the general economic material prosperity of a place. But they are not meant to instantiate the way of life that's shared by the people, by the majority. And so the tribal passions, the religious self-understandings of the people do not find expression in a politics of administration. And the policies that conduce to protecting individual rights and creating material prosperity are policies that maybe require experts to hammer out, to figure out. They're not policies that are always legible to the people. They're not policies that answer to popular frustrations directly. And so the Anti-Federalists said at the time that the Constitution was proposed that this Constitution will suffer from what we now call a democratic deficit. The Constitution will not enjoy the confidence of the people. The people will not feel a connection, especially to the national legislature. This relatively small national legislature with people coming from places as diverse as Georgia and Maine. That was always the contrast that the Anti-Federalists evoke, would not present a kind of mirror or portrait of the people that the people could recognize themselves by looking at. And indeed, they thought that national politics would be dominated by an elite class, as the Federalists hoped that it would. So there were really two great innovations subsequent to the ratification of the Constitution that rectified this defect. I think the Anti-Federalists, in fact, correctly diagnosed a defect in not just the American Constitution, but a defect in the modern state. That there's this gap between the administrative politics of the modern state that acts toward only very general shared purposes on tens of millions of people, and popular attachments and loyalties and understandings. There's a gap, so that in the politics of administration, which is not the politics of rule, there is a real intentional disconnection between the people and their politics. And two innovations were designed, were invented in subsequent to the Constitution's ratification to rectify this defect. The first came in the 1820s. It was designed by Martin Van Buren, and that was the mass party, the party that connected the elites in the national legislature with the street, with the neighborhood, with the region. Van Buren organized the Democratic Party to get Jackson and then himself elected, and created a party that would really turn out the vote so as to both elect presidents and legislators. And the second innovation was the Rhetorical Presidency. And it might even be that Wilson designed this because the innovation of Van Buren really wasn't working sufficiently well. So Wilson thought, to make the Constitution work, we need a president who presents himself directly to the people, who interprets their longings and needs and interests, and converts those into a program, or even more than a program, a laundry list of policies, into a more generalized public philosophy. And by soliciting popular support, empowers that public philosophy through the presidency and leads the legislature. So the president, unlike the restrained, constitutional, formal 19th century president, would have to be more informal, would have to present himself to the people more directly. And so, for instance, one thing Wilson does when he's president is he revives a practice that had fallen out of use after Washington. He presents the State of the Union address in person, in a spoken speech in Congress. After George Washington had done that, but with Jefferson, they began a convention of delivering it in writing. Partly, I think, because Jefferson didn't want to speak in public. So Wilson starts this, and in the speech he addresses policy and program in a way that previous presidents hadn't done, and he presents himself as the leader of a popular movement. So Wilson was the architect of the Rhetorical Presidency that liberated demagoguery, invited presidents to become popular leaders of a sort that they had resisted being for 100 years prior. he thought out the ideal of a rhetorical presidency before it was acted out by presidents. He made it legitimate before it was exercised. Indeed, he legitimated the use of all sorts of technologies that didn't exist during his presidency, but which arrived shortly after. So the technology of amplification of microphones arose in the 1920s, and it was legitimate for presidents to use this in not just speaking to legislators, but speaking to the people in a rally. Radio, television, and now SMS, short message service text. So Franklin Roosevelt mastered radio and adopted a kind of informal presence at the fireside, chatting with people after dinner, those fireside chats, and television arguably really wasn't mastered until Ronald Reagan, though through his years as an actor really understood the warmth of the medium and realized he didn't have to sort of scream into the television camera the way even many candidates do now. SMS text was really of no use, apparently, to Clinton and Obama, Jeb Bush. No one really figured out how to use it to connect, to create an unmediated connection with the people before Donald Trump did. And his texts that seem undigested. That create a kind of that create an immediate connection between his thoughts and his passions and his followers, and the immediacy of the connection is testified by the crudeness of his expression. He's not afraid to say things that are impolite or would otherwise be indecent. That just proves that nobody's controlling him and nobody's corrupting him. That he really is the instrument of his followers. So these spontaneous, authentic, immediate connection Trump establishes, both there and in his rallies, where he doesn't deliver speeches or stump speeches. He was proud, he's still proud that he has no speech. He's so smart he doesn't need to have a speech. He just writes down a few words and stands up and gives a kind of Hugo Chavez-esque, I don't know what to call it. It's not a speech, entertainment hour, and he doesn't shy away from division. So Jim Caesar, in his book on Martin Van Buren and the development of the Democratic Party, or the innovation and modes of presidential selection, differentiates between soft demagogues and hard demagogues. Soft demagogues flatter the people, but they do so in a sort of benign way. And so you could imagine, that someone who stands up and persuades the people that, yes, indeed, they can, rule and govern. Yes, we can, as a kind of soft demagoguery. It's a lie. It's not really true. The truth would be, well, we really can't, or it's going to be awfully difficult, or once in a while, if we get really lucky, we can, but that doesn't make for such a good speech. But there's nothing really corrupting about causing people to believe that, yes, they can. Soft demagoguery, it flatters people's understanding, wish to be powerful. Hard demagoguery divides people against themselves for the sake of elevating a leader. And it seems to me that Trump has legitimated this kind of demagoguery, that in his comments on, say, Megyn Kelly, or on Muslims who he insisted were dancing in Newark after 9/11, or his insistence that Hispanic judges can't decide cases that involve him because they would be, of course, too biased to make a fair decision. And then more generally, Hispanic immigration is corroding the country. This sort of talk is unprecedented, and it's a kind of hard demagoguery that I don't believe we've ever seen in American politics, and so it raises the question. I mean, whether the Constitution, which was meant to proscribe on Toulous's account, or at least restrain demagogic impulses of the ambitious, will in fact succeed at restraining Trump, or whether Trump will succeed and overwhelm in a way that even the rhetorical presidents of the 20th century didn't, the Constitution of Madison and Hamilton. And I should be clear that I don't really, when I think about the possibility that Trump's example might succeed at overwhelming the Constitution, I don't think, my worry isn't really about Trump. I don't really think he's the threat. I think the threat comes in much younger people who are watching his example, young people who find their own obscurity kind of unbearable, and who want to make a name for themselves, and imagine doing that by becoming a leader, a popular leader. And there's maybe no more effective way to make a name for yourself than by being president. And who are sort of watching him and studying his example, and learning about what's permissible and also what's effective. He's enlarged the scope of what's rhetorically permissible in order to gain power. And it might be that there's some young person whose fangs are sharper, and whose internal restraints are even weaker, if they exist at all, who will improve on this example and overwhelm the constitutional restraints that have heretofore existed. And I think that there is, in the country right now, a kind of occasion or an invitation for this kind of demagoguery because of the inability of either party to successfully assemble a durable governing majority. In my lifetime, neither party has succeeded at this, since Johnson intentionally destroyed the New Deal governing coalition for the sake of passing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans have been able to cobble together another a replacement for that. And they've exchanged power. Each time one of the parties gets a chance to rule, it seems to do something that it seems to exceed its warrant and do something that causes the people to turn against it. So, just in the last few years, the Democrats the Republicans had unified control of the government in 2002, and by 2006, they lost the House, which they had had since '94. The Democrats got unified control in 2008. By 2010, they lost the House and then the Senate. And in each case, I sort of imagine, well, what would have happened, if the Republican, I think it's a failure of leadership. The compassionate conservatism might have succeeded at creating a durable governing majority. That was Karl Rove's aim, and that was George W. Bush's aim. And if they hadn't invaded Iraq, or if the Iraq invasion had been a success, maybe they could have succeeded. Under Obama, Rahm Emanuel, who had wanted to be Speaker of the House but was persuaded to go to the White House to help Obama out, told Obama, don't go for something like the Affordable Care Act. Go for something more modest and incremental, something that kind of expansion of Medicaid that covers more poor children. Obama said, "Look, this is why we've got unified control. This is what it's for. This is what our victory's for. We're going to use it to do something." And Rahm, who had engineered the victory in the House in 2006, the Democratic victory, knew what the cost of it would be to those marginal House seats, and he laughed. He said, "I'm going to Chicago. I'm going to go be mayor. You take care of this mess yourself." And he knew what would happen, and the Democrats did give up their majority. So on one hand, it seems that each time one of the parties gets control, they go further than they and almost knowingly go further than opinion warrants, and they give up their constitutional majority. Or it could be that it's not just leadership. It could be that the country is just so fractured that there is no people as such that agrees in such a way, in a large enough and steadfast enough way, that we can use the Constitution to really govern ourselves. And in this circumstance, I think there is a real invitation to the kind of demagoguery that Trump perhaps has legitimated. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it. Who's got a question? Tom.
This is maybe a small question, but in presidential politics, it seems there's been one sort of institutional change the last 40 years, which is the elevation of primary politics, the demotion of power of the parties in a certain way. And that was a big debate as well, especially on the Democratic side about their, electors, or superdelegates, I guess, right? And it just seems to me that a lot of evil was caused by the promotion of primary politics, because it's a system that, in a way, necessarily invites demagoguery. And it's well known that the primary electorate is not the same as the general electorate, and the primary electorate invites certain kinds of insanity or imprudence or irresponsibility. So I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I think even if we had closed primaries, that would still be that would still allow the parties to exert more effective party elites, in particular, people who really understand themselves as partisans and work for candidates, cycle after cycle, give them more power over the nomination. It was amazing to witness the Republican Party really lose control of its presidential nomination because of the primary system. A lot of my Democratic friends, Harvey, blame Republicans for Trump. You'll be interested to hear. And I always tell them, well, I don't know any Republicans who supported Trump. They all opposed him. All my Republican friends vigorously opposed him. And they supported people like Jeb Bush. Look what that did for them. Yeah, he appealed across the partisans to an electorate that I don't think even really identifies itself as partisan, as Republican. Yeah, so I wrote in this book, The Promise of Party, one of the chapters is a defense of the closed party primary. But I didn't take up the question of superdelegates, which were the thing that allowed the Democratic Party to resist the Sanders candidacy and nominate Hillary, and that's lost its legitimacy. I don't think we'll see superdelegates in the same numbers again.
Would you say that's an accident, that these forms of party control have lost their legitimacy? That is, in 1968 or whatever, there was a decision made that we were going to start using primaries in presidential contests, and that was just a mistake that could have been avoided, or is there a sort of democratic trend that invites this demagogic option?
Yeah, the primary, the direct nomination, election is an American innovation that has been used almost nowhere else in the world, and it comes out of the progressive era, and it was invented for a bunch of reasons. The sort of normative reason was to disempower the party bosses and turn these party nominations directly over to the wholesome people. But the truth is that the party bosses in many cases wanted primaries as well, for a variety of reasons. And when they first were employed in the early decades of the 20th century, they created an enormous amount of confusion, and in particular concerning who should be allowed to participate in them, and how to keep track of who should be allowed to participate in them. And this is, I remember in the 2008 campaign, my wife was working the polls down in Austin, Texas, and that was the election where it might have been, I can't remember exactly whether there was a primary or it was a primary election, and there were interesting contests in both the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party. There were contested nominations in both parties at the time, and people came in and wanted a Republican ballot and a Democratic ballot. They had thought about it. They told her, they were ready to vote in both. They wanted to vote for, say, McCain and Obama, and she would say, well, you have to choose. And they would kind of, what do you mean I have to choose? And get kind of upset. Well, this is a party primary. It's only partisans who are supposed to, in Texas, you can choose on the day of the election, but you only get to choose one. And they still couldn't quite process it, although they, obeyed and in the end chose one. So that kind of confusion as to who should be, participating in this goes right back to the beginning. And I think as that system didn't, it didn't take over presidential nominations until after the McGovern-Fraser Commission kind of made primaries a bigger part of the Democratic nominations. And I think they might reflect, a kind of failure of elite governance. In that moment, in 1972, a failure of the bipartisan elites in the engagement in Vietnam. And I think, even right now, we're, as I said in this seminar last week, I think our politics is still digesting the dual failure of neoliberal and neoconservative elites in the 90s and 2000s with respect to finance and Iraq. And that's delegitimated the class that would have, claimed control of the nominations and participated in caucuses or closed primaries. The elites have shown themselves in many cases to be less than worthy. That makes party primaries and the democratization of things seem preferable.
Yeah.
Has there been a time in presidential history where hard demagoguery was the dominant strain before? And because, clearly if it has, then it would have returned to not so, but is this a profound paradigm shift in the...
Yeah, that's my guess that it is. I'm not a master of campaign, presidential campaign rhetoric, but based on my back of the envelope understanding of it, it seems to be, I think this is something new. Yeah, as it came from the mouth of the major party nominee. And even you could say that even Trump was somewhat careful in his hard demagoguery. There are further steps that could be taken, but I think my hunch is that this is new. What do you think, Harvey?
I'm wondering about hard demagoguery.
Yeah.
If you look at the way demagoguery is presented in Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, Thucydides, the hardness of it is in the attack on elites. And you see that in Trump as well, that it's an appeal to the people as against the elite, and that means all the better sort, or the notables, the refined, the educated, and as such, and there's a chapter in Machiavelli in the Florentine Histories of book. I write this down, everybody. In book 3, chapter 13, where a demagogue addresses the.
I remember.
The Wool Guild, and he goes into the. It's a thoroughgoing critique of everything that a quote gentleman unquote is, so this might be the sort of ultimate or thoroughgoing presentation of the content of demagoguery. So that particular mode of attack. And
attacking the elites.
Yes. And you do this by always raising the question of justice in such a way as to name or denounce particular gentlemen or nobles of the ruling class, and so that demagoguery specializes in punitive rhetoric and punishing people. Likes to do that. Mm-hmm. More, not so much distributive, but punishing.
Mm-hmm. We're going to get a special prosecutor and sick him on Hillary Clinton after I'm elected.
Yeah. That's right. Lock her up.
Yeah, lock her up.
Lock her up.
That was the slogan
Remember
of the Trump
Does
campaign.
that exclude divisive rhetoric, just trying to divide the population against itself, racial rhetoric? Was Hitler a demagogue?
Yeah.
Sort of rhetoric that tries to divide and conquer a population. Are they not demagogues? Do they need another name?
Well, I mean, that's what I'm calling, that's what I think of, that's what I was thinking of when I thought of hard demagoguery, and I think of somebody like Mugabe going after homosexuals. When his popularity goes down, he singles out a group that he knows the people also hate, even if the group doesn't exist as a social group because it's so tyrannized already.
Examples.
Yeah, and then by going after that group and by persecuting, putative members of it, though he's destroyed his country, collects popular opinion to himself and restores his popularity. So that's the attacking an elite. I think of, in that case, so I guess we could say that Madison in the 1790s, when he writes the Candid State of the Parties, and he says that he doesn't identify the party or the particulars, so he doesn't charge Hamilton with this, but he says one party basically wants to reintroduce monarchy and doesn't really think that the people are capable of ruling. And that was the Jeffersonian charge against the Federalists from 1795 to the end of the Monroe administration. And Monroe, too, used to say that even though he diminished, party acrimony, he also used to say that the Federalists would try to reintroduce monarchy at the first available opportunity. So that that would suggest that there has been a kind of demagoguery of the sort that you just described, Harvey. But this is what I'm more worried about is two things: making latent divisions in the population active. So, if I walk into a room, I think of the demagogue this way. You walk into a room and there are 100 people. Say you want to be whatever, dean of the faculty, it's an elected position. And you walk into a room of faculty and most of them don't know you and they just don't care about you. They just don't even know who you are. You can try to say something inspiring and get them to like you. Or you can just remind 60% of them why they should hate 40% of them. And remind the natural scientists and the social scientists why they should hate the humanists or something. And then they'll think, well, you're my man. And so by turning half the room against the other half, you elevate yourself. And that's the strategy that I think. And so with respect to Trump, what I was worried about before his election was that his popularity would plummet and he would really go for it. That he has an instinct for this kind of divisive, hard demagoguery, and he would go for it with everything he has to try to restore his popularity. And subsequently, I came to be more worried about just the example he was setting that some future, ambitious power seeker would follow.
Yes, Matthias.
First question and then my point. The question is, have you looked into the presidency of Andrew Jackson? Because I remember in the process, in the campaign period, there was a lot written about, or maybe not a lot, but things that I read about comparing him to Trump and how American democracy had recovered somehow. So I thought it was interesting. And in that context, your concern for the young person drawing an example from Trump, isn't that ultimately a concern that hinges on his success? Because I don't think anybody would think that people growing up seeing Hitler saw that as a possible way to be, because of the outcome, really.
Yeah.
So it's kind of moderated by the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, he's already had such success that his example now has a kind of power. I kept, didn't
Well,
you
that's
think?
kind of where we end up, right? I mean, we end up with like no Korea and no Syria and a lot of problems, a lot of places that
It
are.
remains to be seen.
Yeah.
The full success or failure of this remains to be seen. When we think of the various things that presidential aspirants do that cause them overnight to lose any hope of winning. Howard Dean screamed somewhat hysterically after a loss, and the Dean scream destroys his presidential hopes overnight, or there's just one gaffe, I guess, the gaffe that destroyed. Not that you can think of him in every campaign. There are these things that just systematically demote.
He defied all of them.
Yeah. So I kept expecting that he would show that this sort of technique was ineffective by failing, and that his failure would reveal itself before the nominating season was over. And so look, he's president. You're right. I mean, now there still remains a possibility there could be a kind of failure that neutralizes this example. But so far, it's just the opposite. The examples are more powerful because of his success. And yeah, I think the effort to look to the Jacksonian analogy is an effort to kind of normalize Trump.
Well, anybody can comment on how accurate is that effort? I mean, how real is it, or are we just kind of buying bomb?
It's not. There's something to work with, but I don't understand Jackson to have. Again, we don't know what Trump will actually be, and whether he'll go for even more divisive rhetoric than he went for in the campaign, or whether he will, whether the office, Hamilton's office of the presidency, will succeed at causing him to want to elevate himself and display more dignity. But if he goes the way of a sort of vile demagogue, if he makes what was previously unspeakable and indecent permissible, if he continues in that direction, then I don't think the Jackson analogy will be appropriate. If he just reconnects a disconnected constituency to national politics, working class Americans who felt alienated from both parties, if he just succeeds at kind of mobilizing them and connecting them, and over the next 3 years resists the sort of rhetoric that characterized his campaign and behaves in a more dignified way, then in the end of his first term, maybe the Jacksonian analogy will seem more apt. I'm hoping for the best, but...
Professor Sandel.
Well, I wonder if you would, it's a wonderful paper and diagnosis. I wonder if you would entertain 2 cheers for demagoguery on the following grounds. You juxtaposed the administrative conception of the executive that the founders had and that you saw as inadequate. And then parties, and later the Rhetorical Presidency, was an attempt to build in the democratic dimension that the administrative executive lacked. But when you mention, following Jeffrey, the Woodrow Wilson as the exemplar of the Rhetorical Presidency, when I think of Woodrow Wilson in retrospect, I don't think of him as a great rhetorician. I think of him as in a way, the author of the 20th century administrative state. After all, maybe that's because I'm thinking of the Woodrow Wilson School that's in his name. But also, he, coinciding with the progressive era faith in technocracy and efficiency and depoliticization of administration, seemed that his rhetoric drew from the rationale of administration, and that conception of presidential rhetoric, administrative rhetoric, the rhetoric of efficiency, seems to be a powerful strand from Woodrow Wilson up through Obama and Hillary Clinton, whose political rhetoric it draws deeply on a kind of conception, a technocratic conception of the common good. And so the elites against whom Trump mobilizes voters are elites of both parties whose political rhetoric is largely based on technocracy, a technocratic view of the common good. And people are rebelling. One way of interpreting the way that was left open for Trump's demagoguery was that politics, democratic politics, had been emptied of larger purpose and meaning by an elite rhetoric, especially at the presidential or national level, of technocracy, a seemingly value neutral. It's a kind of furtive ideology that doesn't announce itself or defend itself as an ideology, which is part of what makes it so galling and which generates such resentment that creates the way for Trump's unapologetic demagoguery. So I guess my question is there a dialectic between the administrative impulse that goes all the way back to the founders who didn't want the messiness of parties, and the technocratic politics of that Trump kind of swept away, such that the rhetoric, the dominant rhetoric of the presidency, or of national elites more broadly, drew on this kind of furtive ideology of efficiency and technocracy, which proved hollow and incapable of inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that on Toulous's account, Wilson is, a kind of demagogue that the 19th century presidents didn't equal, because he was willing to present himself directly to the people. He was willing to there are two aspects to his rhetoric that made him more demagogish. One was that the vision thing. He thought it was the job of the president to articulate a vision that generalized popular, yearnings and interests and needs. And then the second thing was a sort of policy list, a programmatic list of policies that translated that vision into administration or into laws and that changed things. And so that direct popular appeal, though it was restrained by, you could say, the translation into policy, it wasn't an emotional appeal.
It was a policy wonkish.
Yeah, coupled with vision. So you might say, what I would say on your account of the administrative state is the real defect is that Wilson is a kind of rationalism that causes people in the Wilsonian mode to forget that that vision depends on defending a conception of justice that isn't that's going to be controversial, because we can't come up with a definitive logos to defend it with finality, and it's going to necessarily involve what you call a conception of the good, not just a sort of universal conception of right. And so in Obama's case, if you look back to his rhetoric about the Affordable Care Act, the singular achievement of his 2-year presidency, he really had a hard time defending that in moral terms. His initial defenses of it invoked things like the donut hole. The ACA Act would solve the donut hole or fill the hole, or I don't know. And it was an issue with Medicare, and it's a technical problem with the way Medicare coverage worked. Or it would cover, if you have children, they're now covered until 25. So that's an appeal to a discrete demographic that's now going to get a benefit it didn't get before. Or if you have a pre-existing condition, now you don't have to worry in the way you might have had to worry before. So again, a minority that gets a sort of benefit, maybe, good thing, but it didn't appeal to the common good and say, well, the kind of country we want to be is only going to be possible if we have a policy like this one, in which we share risks that end up getting loaded on particular individuals for no particularly good reason. And
to help each other out when we're sick. You could imagine writing that speech. Obama couldn't give it, and I don't think he could think in those terms because he thinks that it's just true. This policy is just a way of enacting what's true, and no reasonable person could ever disagree with it. But there's another conception of the common good that emphasizes personal responsibility and the kind of initiative that people are more likely to take if they, shoulder risks more individually. And there's a lot to be said for that conception of the common good too. And that's what makes the Obama conception controversial and kind of incomplete, but also, compelling. Anyway, yeah, so I think you could have an administrative state that is an administration that figures out how to apply a general principle to the individual insurance market, a very complicated thing, and lots of bureaucrats doing that and working out all the details. That's a government and administrative state, but you could defend it with a vocabulary that inspired support and inspired opposition, more enthusiastically.
Yes. Bryan.
Thank you for the presentation. My question has to do with maybe a bit of a contrast that Professor Toulis doesn't mention, or Toulis doesn't mention in the book. Specifically, before Wilson was William Jennings Bryan, who in 3 presidential campaigns, and then the one he didn't run in, made possible the Democrat Party away from the old libertarian style to the progressive. Now, he was the orator directly to the people before the radio. Before recordings, he was the rhetorical presidential campaign, although he never became president. But when he transformed the party into this more populist mode, he was at least restrained by his religion. He would back away from saying, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm not anti-Catholic. Race was a different question. The reason I mention this is that Trump might also have an effect of transforming his party the way Bryan did. These more populist leaders tend to do that, and I guess Trump, you compare him to, say, someone like Buchanan in 90 or Huckabee in 08 or Santorum in 012. Each of those people were kind of this more populist attempt, insurgency, yet they were still moderated in some respects. Trump doesn't have that moderation. So my question is, without that moderation, as a contrast to, say, someone like Bryan, in transforming his party from an old libertarian style, what would that lead to if he succeeds? What would he transform it into with this lack of restraint on his part?
Gosh, I don't know. What would he? What? So, I guess you're suggesting that apart from whatever pathology he may introduce into the regime, there's also something at stake just for the Republican Party. That he may redefine the Republican Party in ways that make it that make it something new and different going forward. It's hard for me to imagine. This is the sort of note I ended the paper on. One of the ways that the Constitution gives presidents an incentive not to be demagogues is through the offer that it issues to rule. The Constitution says you can rule in spite of all of the constraints that this politics of administration imposes. You can rule. All you have to do is elect a majority to the Congress and a majority to the Senate and elect presidents, not just this term, but in a sequence of terms. And in order to do that, given the way, in order to create a constitutional majority, you need a lot more than 50% plus a few stragglers. You need to get to 55 or 58, and it needs to be spread out across the whole country, and it needs to endure in time. And the idea, I think the Madisonian idea, is that kind of majority, that kind of constitutional majority, for one thing, is an achievement. It's not just there. It's not a natural majority, the way a faction is a natural majority of a locality. So it's going to require some political entrepreneurship, and it's going to be a very, very diverse majority. It's going to be what we call a coalition. And the appeal that brings that kind of majority together is going to have to be general enough and respectful enough that it almost approximates the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So that's the invitation, and Trump could, if he really wants to rule, he might. That's the constitutional invitation. If he listens to it, then he'll understand that he has to temporize and he has to moderate, and he has to appeal. And he may, being elected by a national coalition, I mean, the president should see this more clearly than any other actor in the constitutional order. He should be able to see this more clearly than those Republican members of Congress from the gerrymandered districts or just from South Carolina, who don't need to think broadly because they're going to get reelected time in, time out, and so if he does that, then he won't. That's the way he'll leave the Republican Party. If he indulges the instincts that proved so effective for him in the campaign, then I think he'll fail to do that for the Republican Party, and whether the legacy of that harms the party for a long time going forward, I don't know.
He seems to have a taste for the outrageous rather than the moderate, to put it mildly. I mean,
like Silver,
and to profit from it too. Isn't that his appeal?
That he can
go beyond the bounds of good taste, well into the realm of indecency,
and still not get hurt,
and get helped.
Yeah.
Yes.
You talked about democracy and demagoguery, and you seem to think that Trump is a demagogue without a super clear definition, and that somehow is connected to democracy. But democracy itself doesn't seem all that out of control, with half the people not voting. Even the Democratic Party, they didn't have a particularly high turnout in their primaries, which were well publicized. Didn't have in the primary, they didn't have that high a turnout. Protesters at the Trump rally turned out to be actually hired by George Soros. I mean, this doesn't sound like a populist uprising against the elite. So, I'm not sure what how do you reconcile that? I mean, how much of a connection is there? I mean, how much of this is democracy out of control as opposed to?
It may be that the depoliticized nature of the country creates that much stronger and that much louder an invitation to demagoguery, to kind of rouse people, to get them to support you, means that you have to shock them. And so I don't know that sort of passivity or apolitical tendency of so much of the population, tempers demagoguery, makes it less of a threat. It might make it more of a threat.
Jacob, yeah.
So you wrote a book on polarization in the parties. Now, in discussing Trump, you contextualize him in terms of the emergence and development of the rhetorical presidency. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the polarized atmosphere of politics over the past 20 years or so, and how that serves as a sort of background for Trump's emergence. And if you could, related to your question, a large portion of the electorate is not participating in politics. And some have argued that's partly because they alienated from the very polarized atmosphere that politics has generated, right? And maybe that has something to do with the primaries. And so the people who are involved tend to be a little bit more extreme than the people who have removed themselves from the political universe. And in that context, does a person like Trump, is it more likely that someone like him can really succeed, right, with his kind of rhetoric? And so I was just wondering more about polarization as a background to Trump's emergence, if that's sort of...
Yeah, I tend to be more sympathetic to polarized parties than most people, in that I think public opinion, what passes for moderate public opinion or centrist opinion is often a kind of ambivalence or simultaneous attraction to two sorts of strains of two public philosophies that aren't very compatible. In the most sort of sharp sense and narrow sense, people like a government that does more, and they like a government that costs less. And so since 1980, they voted for both of those over and over again. And even after sort of carving out all the waste, fraud, and abuse, it still isn't enough to cover the cost of government doing more. So the Democratic Party, in my adult lifetime, since Mondale ran in 1984, when I was a freshman in college, Mondale promised, I can even adduce another person. My mother ran for the state legislature in New Hampshire when I was a kid, and her slogan was, higher taxes for better education. And that was Mondale's slogan in 1984. He promised that he would raise your taxes, and he thought the government should do more to help the most vulnerable and poor. And it's a coherent thing, and Republicans in general want the government to do less, or conservatives, I should say, want it to do less, and cost less, cut taxes, and that's the Freedom Caucus. And I think, in a way, the Democratic formula, I guess both of those are coherent, but voters want a piece of each, and that's hard, I think, for a government to really do, to cut taxes and also expand prescription drug coverage. And that's what the Bush administration was: 3 tax cuts and a new entitlement and a new war. And that produces, add a financial crisis to that, and you have $2 trillion deficits. And that's, I think, the tendency of the Trump administration, too. So that's what centrism really amounts to, $2 trillion deficits.
Yes, Martha.
I'd like to go back a little bit to the discussion of Trump's rhetoric, or where is he drawing it from, and so forth. And I guess I'm making a couple of remarks. I won't pretend that it's a question, but I would be interested in your response. It sounds like the group has identified, on the one hand, a kind of technocratic political discourse, which is all the nuts and bolts of policy, and it loses people, and it's boring, and so forth. And then on the other hand, you have the sort of overly massaged and masticated rhetoric of politicians who've been coached and focus grouped to the point where they can't utter they can only utter 5 phrases, and they utter them constantly, and that also is very off-putting. And so where do you go for an authentic, popular voice? And I would suggest that in American history, one of the places where that voice would come from was the South. Whether it was black Southerners or white Southerners, they were usually the best political rhetoricians. They came out of the church. They had those rhythms, those Baptist rhythms that Obama used to do his best to imitate. But they had a kind of force. It was kind of the most musical part of our speech. And for a long time, Southern politicians had a real edge because they could dominate the politics with that music. And I think that's maybe gone. I don't know where it's gone, but I don't see it around very much. So what have we got? We've got the media. And we've got a media that, number one, has been liberated from decency by going back to George Carlin and the counterculture and 7 dirty words, and attacking the FCC for having some kind of controls on what you could broadcast. Number two, you've got the deregulation that happened under Reagan, which basically put the FCC out of commission. And then number three, you have all the media that have nothing to do with the FCC, like the internet and all the things that cannot be controlled, even if we wanted to control them. So you have this kind of degradation of popular speech, which found a home. And I know it was about a year ago, Russ, that you and I were on a panel at NEPSA. We talked about this very thing. A degradation of popular speech that finds its home in the entertainment media. And it still astonishes me how rare it is that anybody mentions that Donald Trump spent 12 years in reality television.
Yeah.
12 years. It's a long time. And he was good at it.
That was his apprenticeship.
So when he comes to the political table, he brings with him a finely honed rhetoric of basically divide and conquer, debase your enemy, insult people, bridle at every slight, the whole 9 yards, this whole bag of tricks. It's very recognizable to people. They know exactly what it is. and he's introduced it into our politics. So I'm just wondering, I mean, Toulis ends his book with a chapter on television, right? If I recollect correctly. He has a chapter on TV.
Oh, I didn't read the last chapter.
Oh, well.
Joke.
Well, I signed that to you. He does end that book with a chapter on television, which is in some ways very prescient, but not as prescient as we can be now looking back.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, you and I have kicked this around before, but now that he's president, do you see, I mean, if that's going to change, or if this is just an irreversible process, so we now are going to have politicians who sound like they're on reality TV,
Right.
and whose presidencies basically consist of reality TV with all the tweeting and all that whatnot. So I don't think there's any precedent for this in the ancient political philosophers, or maybe there is. I'd like to know what it is.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's like well, it reminds me of, when sometimes students will come in and ask me, they say they have a B+, and they want to know how to get an A-. And I read their paper, and I realize that there's, among other things, there's just no beauty to it. And I realize that can only happen when somebody's really never read anything. And it's almost like I sometimes feel when I assign papers that it's like asking people to write songs, people who've never heard music. Whereas, and you try to give them all the rules of what a song is: verse, chorus, verse, bridge, chorus, end, or something. And that's not going to help them if they've never heard a song. And so we say, go out and attract people to vote for you. Go speak in a way that causes them to want to listen to you and to feel your magnetism and to give you money and time and votes. And there has to be some sort of there have to be some ingredients in the culture for that, both for the population. We learn to find people attractive and interesting through certain experiences, and potential leaders learn to talk or sing in a way through the practices that are out there. So if we're not, preachers, I guess that's one way to, you say the Southern politicians had an advantage because of the church and the mode of Southern preaching in the South. And maybe jury trials were the other apprenticeship for politics, and that's the real classic one. People learn to persuade ordinary people by going into a courtroom and trying to persuade a jury to find for their client, not the other side's client. And so the John Edwards is the kind of democratic politician, and you might also say, Abraham Lincoln, that these people, they went in and they learned about what public opinion was, and they learned how to dance with it and ultimately seduce it in the courtroom. And now maybe it's the radio talk show and the reality show. It's how do you get ratings, and that's teaching both audiences and speakers something other than the jury trial once taught. The jury trial taught people really how to make logos effective, how to make argument move people through maybe emotion and appeal to common things. And so politicians who got their start in the courtroom, had to learn about those common things and attachments and popular meanings in order to win cases for their clients. But in today's broadcast world, in today's media world, what people are learning is maybe more like what the hard demagogue knows.
Trump seems to be totally without eloquence of any kind or wit of any kind. So,
Those are always
what
good.
is his appeal? I mean, how does he make do without such helps?
Frequency.
So it's authenticity. And
maybe too the outrageous helps him.
And that, I think, conveys that he's not controlled by anybody. So the opinion that restrains you from saying what you feel and think is an authority that he's not subject to. And those are maybe elites that...
It's kind of an adolescent self-assertion also, which strikes people as something to admire.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the ways to talk about demagoguery would be to say, and this is sort of what sounds like we've been talking about for the last 5 minutes or so, is to say that it's a problem of a charismatic or manipulative person coming along and fooling people into voting for them and whipping them up into all sorts of ways. And that is a way that some people attack Trump, and you have attacked him in that way, obviously. And some people would say, things in America aren't really that bad. It's a prosperous country. For the most part, people are secure. Yeah, there's crime in some places, but, things are pretty good. And another way would be to say, well, demagogues come when there is an actual problem with an incompetent elite class that has failed. And that was also present in your speech. You said, for the past 40 years, or at least the past 20 years, let's say, the elite class has actually done a pretty bad job, so we don't have very good elites. And it makes a difference which of these things it is. And you could say it's both of them, where you have a failed elite class, and then that opens the way for these tricksters to come in and create problems. But if the elites are genuinely poor, they're not worthy of being elites, as you say, it's just a matter of time before this happens, right? I mean, the people can only have the wool pulled over their eyes for so long, to be told that things are great before, they look for someone who is an outsider and wants to shake up the system. So, I mean, I'm not sure which is the worst scenario, if someone could just come along and fool people, or if we're genuinely in a situation where we don't have decent elites. But what's the solution here? It sounds like we need a whole new... we need to improve the ruling class somehow, and there's very little chance of that happening, as far as I can tell. Or we need someone to come along who's such a brilliant rhetorician that he can sort of get people to start loving the Constitution for its own sake, or not worrying about all these problems that they worry about. Because after all, Trump's program, it wasn't just his personality, his program was quite different to what everyone else was offering. So, what do you think about that rambling?
Yeah, I don't want to exaggerate the incapacity and unworthiness of the elite class, the class of people who staff the agencies and who staff the campaigns and who run for office and advise all those. But if we're listening to, if we were to try to explain how Bernie Sanders, who'd never identified as a Democrat, nearly took the nomination, the financial crisis has to be the first part of the explanation. And that Hillary Clinton took this succession of $200,000 checks, 3 of them, I guess, from Goldman Sachs for these chats that she gave at the bank. The reason that was so devastating, and Bernie hit her on that week after week after week for about 8 weeks running before passing that issue off to Donald Trump to use against her. The reason is because people felt like that class just destroyed the global economy and then insisted in this morally nauseating way on being bailed out, or they would destroy it beyond repair. And Hillary seemed like, just like her husband in a way in the 90s, to have been attuned to the needs of that class of finance. Goldman Sachs being the probably most symbolically charged part of it, of that world. So that failure, in the 1990s, Rubin and Summers and Clinton said, if we deregulate this area of commerce, everything will go better. And in 2008, it seems like that deregulation just nearly destroyed the global economy if it weren't for those extravagant bailouts. And so that profoundly weakened Hillary Clinton. Her basic philosophy, her basic argument in the fall of 2015 was that bankers are part of the country too, and that finance is an essential function in a commercial society. And she wants to represent the whole country. And that she didn't understand how devastating that would be, and how devastating it would be to her to be close to the people at Goldman Sachs. And then the Republican Party, remember Jeb Bush trying to explain his relationship to the Gulf War, to the invasion of Iraq. the March 2003 invasion. He was asked, what do you think of it? And he couldn't say that it was a mistake because his brother prosecuted that, and he couldn't say that he approved of it because he knows that it was a failure. And he got all tangled up in that. And then once the reporters realized he was getting tangled up in it, they kept coming after him with it over and over and over again. And it killed him before his campaign, even though he had all the money and was sucking up all the oxygen in the Republican campaign in December and January. His campaign was dead because of the Iraq War. So the elite in the Democratic Party, the presumptive nominee and who became the nominee, was crippled because of the failure of the neoliberal, finance policy in the 1990s. And the presumptive nominee in the Republican Party, the choice of the establishment conservatives, Jeb Bush, was crippled because of the failure of neoconservatives in the 2000s. And that did open the way to Trump and Bernie. I don't mean to say that, therefore, everyone in the State Department, everyone in the Treasury, everyone in the Defense Department, everyone who's ever served in the Senate or in the House, is corrupt and incapable. But those two very big failures. It's hard in politics to atone for a failure. Nobody ever apologizes, but apologies are one thing and atonement is another. And there's no mode of atonement. The only possibility is to elect the other side and throw one side out. So when both sides have failed at that level and in such, chronological proximity, then you really have a kind of systemic crisis.
Yes.
Many have criticized the two-party system's role in the past election. Do you think that having more parties would increase the electorate's susceptibility to demagoguery, or what do you think about that?
My former colleague Glenn Morgan, from his department, called me, and said that he likes to diminish and belittle American political thought because he's British, and so he called me and said that the presidency, which was designed to contain demagoguery, actually inflames demagoguery. And if you really want to contain demagoguery, what you should have is a parliamentary system. That there's no real incentive for Merkel to be a demagogue. She's a she's a parliamentary leader, and so you get these sort of prime ministers who don't have any charisma. They're inside players, and they machinate their way to the top of a kind of party hierarchy, and then if their party's the dominant member of a coalition government, then they get to be prime minister. So yeah, I guess on that view, a multi-party parliamentary system might be more immune to demagoguery than a presidential system. And this is a good question, Victoria, because it allows me to say this, that we want presidential demagoguery in a way. Wilson's innovation was a worthy one. He allowed presidents to become real leaders, and to be leaders, they have to have a base in the population. So the other innovator, by the way, was Teddy Roosevelt. On Toulous's account, just right before Wilson. It's just that for various reasons, Teddy thought the innovation would be limited to him, and that no one after him should really follow his example. Whereas Wilson was laying down a formula for all future presidents to follow, in his mind. Teddy Roosevelt is the best example of what Hamilton wanted a president to be. He's the first president to really fulfill the Hamiltonian intention, and I think ever since has done it better even than Franklin Roosevelt. So I think, for a variety of reasons, many of them having to do with national defense, but also having to do with the prosperity of the republic and the prosperity of the world. We really want a more powerful leader than Merkel or the German parliament or the British parliament will ever be able to produce. And in order to have that kind of powerful leader, the leader has to have a source of power in the people themselves. The fount has to come from the people itself. And that means that the president will be a demagogue of a certain stripe. And that's what Wilson was trying to do, is license demagoguery, but not too much and not the wrong kind. So yeah, there might be better ways. Like you could have a plural executive, like the European Union, where the member state presidents kind of rotate through every 6 months. Or you could have a plural executive like the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution had. Or I think Switzerland has might have a plural executive. And that's a wonderful way of making sure there's no demagoguery, because there's no unitary executive in the first place, but it also eradicates the possibility of real leadership that we might need to be a global power, to stand up against really potent threats in the world, to protect liberty, and to advance policies like containment that span decades, or to advance economic policies that also span multiple presidential administrations. You need real leadership to do that.
Peter.
Look, the EU. Sorry, I'm going to stop. But the EU, don't you think like the EU could use a leader like this right now? It doesn't have one. It really needs some charisma. It needed some charisma last summer.
You used that word. I was also used before charisma.
Yeah.
Does that help with demagoguery, to explain it or describe it?
Yeah, maybe. And that like Wilson's idea is very intellectual, that the leader intuits and articulates popular needs, but that there's maybe a little magic in that.
But he's a professor. Trump, for example, is not a professor. He couldn't get tenure anywhere but Trump University. Okay.
So in terms of what prepared the ground for Trump, we've talked about a lot of things, Iraq and Obamacare and the primary system. I wonder if there's a deeper underlying cause we've sort of been looking for. And so Book 8 of Plato's Republic, obviously a very different democracy than ours, but the suggestion is that democracy begins with farmers sort of overthrowing oligarchy, and eventually gives rise to demagogues, fostering class hatred, suspicion of the rich, in order to make themselves unscrupulous rulers like those young men with fangs you mentioned. So, the presentation seems to suggest there's a built-in tendency in democracy arising from suspicion of the rich and what we call elites, inequality itself. I think one could also think of Tocqueville's analysis of democracy tending to produce a marriage of what you call kind of soft demagoguery and the administrative state. But so is this, a movement towards demagoguery an inevitable tendency or direction of democracy? And I thought especially something you said a few minutes ago, Wilson loses sight of the need to defend a vision of justice that's going to be in some way controversial. Well, obviously, people are drawn to visions of justice that are controversial, but as democracy unfolds, is that not inevitably going to lead to one with fewer restraints, maybe more hatreds?
Yeah, I take that kind of movement from regime to regime in the Republic to not be a literal kind of account of political change. That political change always sort of goes from whatever democracy to tyranny, and later people played with it more and had things going back and forth, oblivious. Things could go from democracy to oligarchy and back from oligarchy to democracy, and I think that's more accurate. So it's possible. It might be possible for democracy to make itself more formal. Tocqueville says that democracy doesn't like forms and formality, but the regime. Okay. Let me back up. Conservatives think that the problem with America is that it's too equal, and it's becoming more equal all the time. And liberals think that the problem with America is that it's too unequal, and it's becoming more unequal all the time. And there are a fair number of...
So which is right?
And it's not, and the curious thing is, I personally think that both are true. In some respects, we're becoming more unequal, or our money inequality is more unequal, and that brings with it other kinds of inequality. And then there's other sorts of, we're also simultaneously becoming more egalitarian all the time. So I think that's sort of why liberalism and conservatism are both so strong today. They're responding to real realities that are, consistent. But out of there are things that are unequal, and there are forms of inequality that people think of as justifiable and admirable. And from those, we can both sustain forms and formality and create new formalities. So I wouldn't say the only tendency of democracy, is toward tyranny, and it's a one-way street once you get there. You just have to hope for, I guess, some philosophic rule that starts the cycle over again.
What do you think about the media? There's not too much about the media in this book of Tula's.
Yeah.
And the media seems to be both formal and informal. It's informal because it's not officially a part of the government, and yet it claims to be the most, or at least one of the most important parts. And there's a book which describes it as a fourth branch of government. So, and then Trump's hostility to it. He claims the media are the enemy of the American people.
Yeah,
While making them rich.
Right.
He says that while making them rich.
Yeah, Jeff Zucker has never been so happy. And he also charms individual reporters. So he knows, he sort of seems to know what he's doing there.
Awes them. Overawes them.
Overawes them, yeah. So here's a question. Is Trump, a kind of democratic man of the sort that you read about in the Book 8 of the Republic, who's so who's so erotic that he can't distinguish between permissible and impermissible pleasures, and wants to eradicate, those distinctions and become a kind of tyrant for whom all is possible? Or is he sort of an oligarchic man who's really quite, rigid and self-denying and disciplined? And so that's a question. I mean, I think he's maybe a little bit more like an oligarch than a Democrat.
What about a Democratic man? Vulgar.
He's a Democratic man too.
Yeah.
Well.
Wait, go ahead. The other fellow there.
So I noticed you talked about in the paper that maybe when we just all get together, we can't rule constitutionally, that's just the state of the U.S. now. To what extent do you feel like Trump's rise kind of exemplifies like a moral failure on like specifically the part of the American people, like that they're willing to tolerate this vulgarity that maybe they hadn't in the past, or had they always been willing to tolerate this and it's just nobody had went this far before?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to, I don't know that many people in general, but the people I know who voted for Trump and who are very excited about his election are some of the, insofar as I can know another person's character, just sweetest and most lovely people I know at all. And so I tend to draw a fairly, bold line between the characteristics of his supporters and his characteristics, and not assume. So, for instance, if I were to say that Trump is a racist, or says racist things, or appeals to racist notions, I wouldn't assume all supporters are racists. It's a further question. The interesting question is why good people would vote for someone who's crude and vile and so forth. And actually, I think that that's a really interesting question that we should be answering without prejudice. So I'll give you an example, just an anecdote. I hire a woman to clean my house. She comes every Tuesday. and she works very, very hard physical work. And when she's sick or if she takes a day off for a personal reason, no money comes in. She doesn't have an employer. There's no benefits, and she lives by the sweat of her brow. And she does, and it's a very competitive industry with no barriers to entry. So she just can't charge a lot and doesn't make a lot. And I asked her last summer who she was supporting her, whether she paid any attention to the presidential race. And she said, oh, Trump. She was very excited about Trump. And she was incredibly happy after the election. And I sort of celebrated with her. I said, congratulations. I hope your man does a great job. And I'd ask her, aren't you upset about the things he says about women? And she says, well, Russ, you hear a lot of things. People say a lot of things, she told me. I don't know what exactly that meant, but she discounted it. And he caused her to believe that he was going to represent her interests vastly more effectively than Hillary Clinton caused her to believe. And I am curious about why, and I'm not sure she's wrong. I think we have to study this in an unprejudiced way. And I certainly wouldn't attribute to her whatever characteristics I might attribute to Donald Trump. Yeah, Martha, do you want to jump in?
I just wanted to share briefly, I have a colleague at BC who's from northern Maine and who voted for Trump and who spent several months of the last few months before the election going to Trump rallies in northern Maine. And this colleague, in a conversation just after the election, said that every single one of those rallies, now this is just secondhand, every single one of those rallies was opened by a fairly well-known religious leader who talked to people about how the Obama administration was against religious liberty and the Obama administration was imposing its secular values and it was imposing liking sexuality on all these people and so forth and so on. That whole kind of religious, I won't even call it the religious right, but a certain religious agenda. And so I asked her, well, how could religious people support a guy like Trump? He's really not a model of Christian virtue. And she said, well, they're used to sinners. They know that he's a sinner. But they also will take a sinner over somebody who's going to impose their values on you through the government when those values are against your religion. To them, that was worse than just electing a sinner who wasn't going to do that. That's a very limited case, but you might put it in your kit bag of things to consider.
Yeah.
Laura.
Just go back to something I think you asked or talked about, or just to come up in general, in terms of not everybody who voted for Trump necessarily supports everything he said, or not a racist, or misogynist, or Islamophobe, or whatever, but I think Tanisha Coates said this, and I'm sure other people have said this, whether or not everybody who voted for him endorsed those beliefs. By voting for him, they said those beliefs are okay. We're not saying that I personally hold them, but they are, they've given them approval by electing somebody who's espoused all these beliefs vocally and loudly, repeatedly. The other thought I had was that there's all this talk about how he wasn't expected to win, or a lot of people didn't expect him to win, Trump to win. But we had an event a few weeks ago, and Wesley Morris and Jenna Wortham were two of the panelists, and they talked about how it wasn't a surprise to them, and it wasn't a surprise to a lot of people of color that somebody like Trump could be elected in America. And I think that's something that we're not really talking about, that this is not necessarily a surprise to a large demographic in this country, that somebody like this, who talks like this, and who does the actions that he did, would be elected.
Yeah, I mean, depending, on your experience, you could hear a lot of crude talk, a lot of racist talk, a lot of sexist talk. It's out there. You can hear it every day if you're in circles where it comes up. It isn't the case that we've had a lot of presidential candidates talking like Trump and succeeding in the past. So in that respect, it's surprising. But the other thing that made it a surprise was the failure of empirical political science to call this election. And so the reason I was surprised, if I were, going to tell you why, is because I was checking, what was it like, Sam Wang's site and the Princeton Election Consortium and maybe 538, I don't know, these sites, and I don't do that work, but they tell me, we understand public opinion. We know how to pull it and measure it and all that better than anyone's ever known before. And here's what's going to happen. And I saw these sort of probability statements and graphs and what have you. And it made me think that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And it made me think it was so, in spite of maybe what was right before my eyes, where I noticed in my neighborhood, a lot of people who had supported Bernie in the primary were supporting Trump in the general election. So that's the other reason it was a surprise.
The other one thing I want to say, it just struck me that there's this new book on Jim Jones, and talking about him being a demagogue. They use that language. And there was just an interview with the author on NPR talking about talk about charisma, how Jim Jones was a con man, that people who were the most ardent followers would know that and discount it because they thought he was doing for the greater good of what, he was against elitism, he was against, the higher ups, and he was supporting the working class and the poor people, and that they were happy to discount the lies and the outright cons because they believed in a bigger cause, and that seemed very striking. Now it is,
Well, thanks so much, Russ. We've got to stop.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a lovely conversation.